state's highest court handed down a big ruling last week on the controversial and ambitious MBTA Communities housing law. In a Wednesday decision, a unanimous Supreme Judicial Court declared that the Attorney General can absolutely sue to enforce this multifamily housing law, but the State Housing Office has to redo its regulations. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Before we get into this week's conversation, though, a quick primer on where we are and how we got here. At the heart of this tangle over state and local power, what it means to be served by public transit, and just how much density is manageable, is a 2021 law that requires cities and towns served by the MBTA system to zone for one district of reasonable size to allow multifamily housing by right. It's part of the state's effort to address what it estimates is a 200,000 unit shortfall by the end of the decade. The town of Milton, an affluent Boston suburb, was the first of now dozens of municipalities to balk at these rezoning rules. Even though its town meeting approved a plan that would meet the Act's requirements, voters overturned that plan by referendum in February 2024. So, Attorney General Andrea Campbell sued to force compliance, but the town argued two things. First, since the law didn't specifically give the AG the ability to enforce the law, the only consequences for non-compliant cities and towns was losing out on the handful of grant programs specifically listed. Second, the guidelines that the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities handed out for how to actually determine if a municipality was compliant, like the size of the zoning district and the deadline to submit a plan, were really regulations that had to be put out through a specific process, but were not. The SJC last week sort of split the baby. The Attorney General can absolutely enforce the law, they said, because Milton's interpretation would, quote, thwart the legislature's purpose by converting a legislative mandate into a matter of fiscal choice. But the so-called guidelines with teeth were actually regulations in substance, the court said, so the Housing Office has to put them out again properly as regulations. Okay, enough background for now. We've covered the MBTA Communities Law and this lawsuit a few times on the podcast, so if you'd like to hear Attorney General Campbell explain why she sued, there's an episode on that. If you want to hear from the original sponsor of the amendment that became the MBTA Communities Law about how they thought it should be enforced and why, there's an episode on that. But today we're breaking down the SJC's ruling and what it tells us about state power and zoning reform. So for that, I am delighted to be joined by Greg Reibman, President and CEO of the Charles River Regional Chamber, and Luc Schuster, the Executive Director of Boston Indicators, a research center at the Boston Foundation. Luc, Greg, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So let's start out with acknowledging that we are talking on Thursday, January 9th, which is all of one day since the Supreme Judicial Court handed down its opinion. And so I'm interested, before we even get started, in just what your initial sort of reactions were to this opinion. Luc, do you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but my sense from looking at the decision over the last just 24 hours is it states pretty clearly two, I think, really important things. One, it directly acknowledges the severity of our housing shortage and acknowledges that the legislature is, totally in its right to act to try and address a crisis of that magnitude. And then the second thing is really specific to state power. One of the big challenges, I think, through the last several years of implementing MBTA communities has been this tug and pull between what's the state's proper role and what's the proper role of local communities. And the court decision, I think, makes really clear that there is an appropriate role for the state to play here in addressing this challenge, because it goes far beyond the border of any one municipality.
And Greg, what about you? You have, over in Needham, a very specific reason to have been watching this decision very, very closely.
Sure, and we can get into that, but we represent four communities: Newton, Needham, Wellesley, Watertown, and Needham is the fourth of those. But I've been watching this. I'm kind of a nerd on this thing. I've been watching municipal meetings in communities all over the state, and the one thing we heard in our four communities and elsewhere was at every meeting there was always somebody. Sometimes it was someone on the board, sometimes it was a member of the audience, often many people saying, "Let's wait until the SJC rules. Let's not go forward. Let's not approve zoning. Let's just wait." So what's really important about what happened yesterday is we now know from the SJC that this law is legal. and we now know that the Attorney General has the ability to enforce it. And that ends a lot of that dialogue of the wait and see. There's no more question about that.
One thing that really struck me as I've been writing about it over the past few days is I went back to the arguments on this in October, and I noticed that a lot of the justices really did seem to indicate that this was a possibility that they were open to, that some of them said in very clear terms, it seems like this law is mandatory. They referred to it as a legislative mandate. They referred to the severity of the housing crisis, but then they got very in the weeds about how specifically regulations about who is and isn't compliant need to be handed out, essentially. There's a whole process for the way that regulations need to be issued, and a few of those steps were missing when it came to these quote-unquote guidelines with teeth that the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities came out. So it was very interesting to me to see essentially the same thing that they had flagged ended up being essentially the opinion, which some people have described as splitting the baby, and some have said, it's a procedural quirk that's easy to get hammered out. So with all of that kind of said initially, I'd like to come back to the note that you made, Luc, about the state power question here. The question about, is this about local control? Is this about having the flexibility to zone in the way that a single town would like? What's your read of what we learned about the relationship between the state and municipalities after this?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, one basic fact that it's important not to lose sight of is all authority around zoning and land use initially lies with the state, and it's a choice that state government makes to cede some of that authority to local municipalities. And I think the political practical challenge is just that for decades, almost all of that authority has been delegated to cities and towns. And so you've got just tens of thousands of local elected officials, planning board members. I'm a year and a half into being an alternate member of the Somerville Planning Board, so I see this myself week to week in Somerville. Lots of very well-intentioned people who view it as their role to make important decisions about what's going to be built in their communities. And MBTA Communities Law comes in as part of a reflection of the state legislature appreciating there needs to be collective action at a greater scale of government to really address the problem. And it feels like a big change to many people. And I think that's really understandable. And we're just in the sort of tough growing pains process, I think, of people understanding what it's going to take to address the problem at scale. And so what's weird about this is, on the one hand, I feel a lot of sympathy for the local agita around how much change this represents. But when you look at just the basic parameters of what MBTA Communities is requiring, it's actually not much of a state, imposition at all. The zones that communities have to design represent something like 1% to 2% of the land area in most of these communities. We're only talking about what's the maximum allowable to get built rather than any mandate to build a certain amount. So I think once people get a better understanding of the actual details of this, I think they'll better appreciate how much local control remains under this approach.
So I'm so glad you brought that up, because we're going to get into this, great fascinating thing called paper compliance, like what it means to technically meet the requirements of the Housing Act, but not really be doing anything new. But first, I think we should note for people that it's a little bit difficult to talk about this case while contextualizing just how widespread the sort of resistance is, because the majority of cities and towns that fall under the MBTA Communities Act purview are either actively in compliance or are working toward it. We're talking about 28 communities who have specifically missed the deadline at the end of this last year, or in Milton's case, the deadline from the year before that, to pass these compliant plans, and 3, including Needham, who have passed compliant plans but are now facing a referendum to essentially toss that away. So, Greg, can you tell me what that's looked like in the regions that you've been monitoring, those who have been in compliance and those who have been more resistant to it?
The Needham referendum and the timing with this court ruling on Wednesday, it felt a little like an October surprise. It would have been much better if it came a month ago or if it came a week after the election. But we have a vote on Tuesday. And on Tuesday, voters in Needham are being asked to either support a MBTA Communities compliant plan that was approved by town meeting after 2 years of planning, or to reject it and send it back. If they reject it, we start all over again. It's got to go back to the planning board. It's got to go back to a special town meeting. It'll take months to do it. So the court ruling on one hand said, this is the law, you got to do it, and that's good, and that's supportive of the yes side, the side that wants to keep this plan in place. The no side is now making the arguments today, in the last 24, 48 hours, that this gives us more time to go back and redo what we've proposed, come up with something that's a little less ambitious, which is the contentious part of what's happening in Needham. Give us something that's less ambitious because we have time now, because the guidelines, the regulations need to be rewritten, so we box ourselves some time. It's hard to know which side is correct. We may know more when we have the emergency guidelines from the governor, whether everything is intact and in place it is. But it did confuse and has confused the conversation in Needham only because it came out 6 days before the vote. And actually, a lot of people have already done early voting.
So sticking with you for a second, Greg, you've written about what it looks like when cities and towns do meet the requirements of the act, but only sort of. It's a little bit complicated. What are we talking about when we talk about paper compliance?
Right. So paper compliance is essentially picking parcels or lots or buildings that were already built out and nothing would be built there. Or in the case of Wellesley, they actually selected a building that was being built already part of its 40B process. So essentially double dipping, right? The building was going up anyway. It was going to be on this parcel, in this case, Wellesley, and we were not happy with that. Chose that as opposed to picking other parts of Wellesley where really it could unlock opportunities. That is actually what's in front of Needham right now. The proponents like Needham's plan because it's ambitious and it adds an opportunity for about 1,200 homes to be built over the next 10 to 15, 20 years. But the plan that the opponents, the ones who want to prevail at the referendum on Tuesday, support a plan that would maybe yield 400 new homes over the course of the next decade or two.
So, Luc, this sort of gets back to what you've written about before and we've talked about before, which is what was the actual scale of the housing crisis when all of this sort of started rolling out, started getting talked about, when it got worked into this economic development bill, and it's just a few little lines in there, but it's caused all of this stir. So what was the promise, and is there reason to think that we're sort of talking about it wrong? We know not to say it's a silver bullet, but what is it?
Yeah, this is a good moment to reflect back on the last couple of years of debating the law with that in mind. I've been worried that both sides of the debate have been overstating the promise of MBTA communities for a while now. And I come at that from the perspective of thinking this is directionally exactly the sort of thing we need to do as a state. We need to act collectively across municipal boundaries to build more housing. I think on the pro-housing side, it got so frustrating, the lack of inaction, that when the state passed this law, there was a lot of just understandable excitement about it. One thing that led to a lot of confusion was the zoned capacity numbers that were flying around. These are the sort of best estimates of how many units could legally get built under the new zoning rules. And I actually forget the original numbers, but it's in the 300,000 or 400,000 unit range. That sounds like a ton of new housing that's going to happen immediately. But people really, I think many just very sincerely confuse that zone capacity number with what would actually get built. We looked at the research around the country of how many properties tend to turn over when an upzoning like this happens. And in a 10-year window, the share of parcels that turn over tends to be in the 5 to 10% range. So, just doing some really back of the envelope math about a year ago, I estimated that a positive, optimistic scenario for MBTA communities was that it might yield 40,000 new housing units in 10 years. Now, is that a lot or a little? It's a little compared to 300,000 or 400,000. CHAPA and the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities have targeted building 200,000 units statewide as a goal for us. So again, 40,000 seems small compared to that. On the other hand, any new home we build is another family that can live in our communities, contribute to our local economy. And if we pass a few laws like MBTA communities over the next several years, 40,000 here, 10,000 here, the governor's legalization of accessory dwelling units is a few tens of thousands of units. That starts to really add up. So I think, big picture, this is exactly what we need to do. It's just not a single silver bullet. And I think both sides have sometimes confused that piece of it.
Well, Greg, what are your thoughts on that?
The zone capacity number has definitely given people fits, and that's caused problems on the floors of town meetings and city councils and on the Facebook discussion groups, because people do not understand that zone capacity is not the same. They don't even understand that not a single unit could be built under this. We're only changing the zoning. We're not demanding or requiring that a single home be built. That's a big problem. To Luc's point about overselling it, I would say absolutely folks are overselling on both sides. And the reality is we've been all in on promoting MBTA communities and promoting the need for more housing as an important economic development tool, because it will bring more customers to our restaurants and shops, and it will bring more workers to our tech companies and office buildings and life science companies, and because it will fill jobs for teachers and everything else. But the reality is that it's going to take decades to do this. It's going to take decades to build ourselves out of this crisis. So while we're selling it as, this will help this company tomorrow, this will allow your coffee shop to be open on Sundays. It's not open now because they don't have the staff for it. The reality is none of that's going to happen anytime soon. So we're moving in the right direction by doing this, but it's not going to solve anything quickly.
I wonder, to both of your points there, does it make it difficult to talk about what the purpose is of a law like this when you're sort of worried about not overstating it, but at the same time, I assume you would like people to be excited about this sort of housing law and process? Like, how do you balance those two interests, Luc?
Jen, you're asking me to, get into to sort of political strategy stuff that's maybe not my wheelhouse, but I appreciate the question, and it's been on my mind throughout this. One thing I'll say is something in the last year I have genuinely been surprised by in a really positive way is how much the existence of this requirement has spurred really positive local organizing by folks like Greg at the Charles River Chamber. There's just been a blossoming of local pro-housing advocate groups in dozens of different communities who are meeting in people's living rooms, strategizing around the right messaging, poring over different zoning proposals and proposing amendments at town meeting. And the fact of the deadline has forced that work into a higher gear in a way that I think has helped develop a muscle for housing reform that we haven't had region-wide in a long time. And that gives me a lot of optimism around the next waves of housing policy reform that could come.
And Greg, what do you think?
No matter whether a community chose paper compliance or defiance or approved something, Luc raises a really important point. In every single community now, we now have active housing advocates who are energized and understand this. And we have communities that have talked about zoning that didn't know what zoning was before. So even if MBTA communities doesn't yield the kind of housing we want, what we've created is really an understanding, a grassroots group of people. These housing advocacy groups are amazing in how much time and energy they put together, and how truly the only way to rebuild the housing and to create the housing we need is by forming coalitions. And what we've seen happen through this process and in the housing fight in the last few years is a coalition of housing advocates, environmentalists who argue about the green benefits of building housing closer to transit, and the business groups. And in a lot of cases, actually, the clergy has joined in, and a few others too, who talk about our moral imperative to meet the needs. So you've got this quartet of housing advocates, environmentalists, business groups, and clergy working together on a common goal, and that should change the dialogue for years.
I'd like to talk a little bit, sticking with you for a second, Greg, about what the, resistance or the opposition has actually looked like. I'm a local reporter by trade. I've sat in on many a zoning meeting and many a civic meeting where people try and grapple with, well, what practically would this individual project look like? What would a broader zoning change look like? What sort of trends in discussion around what this does and doesn't mean have kind of stood out for you, either in terms of what you might view as misinformation or very understandable, sympathetic objections to it? What does that look like in your area?
the opposition to housing goes back decades, if not longer, right? And it's, and that basic core, yes, I like it, but not where I am, exists. But what's changed here is the political discourse in our nation has trickled down to these, conversations, and the social media fights, and the disregard for facts unless they're facts that, conform with your own perspective. That's what we're seeing right now in the battle in Needham, and we saw in other communities across the state, is that everybody's okay with their own facts about this. You can tell people there's a housing shortage. Some people believe it, some people don't. You can tell people, you can make the arguments that the only way to lower prices is by building more homes. Some people just outright refuse to believe that supply and demand is actually a real thing. And that's where the arguments and the headbutting comes in all these communities is, folks stick with their narrative, but they've been empowered by the way we've been rudely talking to each other, across the nation, in politics in general. And so there's an added level of, crankiness, nastiness, and the added place, the fact that there's this, the Facebook or the user groups for this to meet has really made this, turned up the heat on this.
So you can't really talk about housing without also talking about its related systems. Transportation is a big one, and this one is literally, in fact, anchored to, as the name suggests, the MBTA, access to either the main systems or the commuter rail branches or, the Silver Line accessible communities. The Mattapan trolley has really been at the center of the flashpoint around this. So, Luc, as you've been watching basically systems development across different sorts of procedures, different infrastructure. The MBTA has been dealing with its funding crisis at the same time that the state is arguing that access to public transportation is a good way to think about where housing density can be. We talk a lot about transit-oriented development. So my question here is, how have you thought about how helpful or useful it is to anchor these two discussions to each other, given that when local communities argue that they might have less than optimal transit access and therefore should have lower housing obligations, the state has been very, very clear that the reliability of the transit is not what's determining what their obligation is. So help me piece that apart a little bit.
Yeah, there's a bunch in there. I mean, I'd say there's no way to fully separate the transit conversation from the housing one. So I think they're going to have to be related to some meaningful degree no matter what. One challenge with MBTA communities is that I think it's been a bit of a Rorschach test for people wanting to address different pressing challenges we face as a region. And you named many of them, right? There's the housing shortage and housing affordability crisis. There's issues with climate change that we want to address. Breaking down residential segregation. One you hear a little bit less, but is very often on my mind, is opening up access to opportunity for young kids to grow up in, suburban districts with high quality schools. And depending on which of those goals is more forefront of mind, you might design the parameters of the local expectations differently. So things like the debate around whether Milton should be treated as a rapid transit community or not, to me, that's a fair question. From the state's perspective, they're trying to devise a uniform formula that can be applied to 177 communities. It's never going to get it perfectly right. So I don't mind those debates on the margin, but I think it's important to not lose sight of the fact that we're trying to do so many things all at once through this law. And again, really not losing sight of the fact that this is just about zoning rules in terms of the ceiling of what can get built, not a minimum requirement. So the Milton, requirements aren't going to transform that part of Milton into downtown Boston, no matter what.
Greg?
If I could roll back the hands of time, go in the Wayback Machine, I would say, please don't call this the MBTA Communities Act. It's just caused so much confusion about it. But the reality is that transportation is a huge impediment here. And you can have debates on the floors of city councils and town halls and say, when an opponent gets up and says, But our schools, it will overcrowd our schools. Say, well, actually, school enrollment has declined statewide. School crowding is not really the issue. And they could say, but water and sewer. And say, well, actually, our water and sewer systems have been upgraded, or there's a ways to upgrade it. That's not a problem. And so on and so forth until they say, but transportation. And you go, got me, right? Our transportation is not adequate to meet the needs for our housing. And you can argue about it at the edges, but at the end of the day, housing and transportation are so linked, and we need to fix both of them concurrently.
I think the thing that I want to make sure that we hit on before the end of our conversation is essentially, how has the state handled this? What would you like to see from the state here? We're talking basically around the same time that the state has said it will put out these new emergency regulations. So we have not seen them yet, but it's very possible that by the time you're listening to this, those have come out. It's unlikely, based on everybody's conversations so far, that these are going to involve a crazy dramatic overhaul of the entire MBTA Communities Act, because that would be extremely confusing for all of the cities and towns who have already gone through the process. But starting with you, Luc, what are you keeping an eye out for in terms of possible tweaks, responses to it, given that now we know that this is fully enforceable whenever the regulations are put out properly?
Well, the really near-term thing I'm looking at is what Greg flagged earlier, the communities that have been in this sort of middle ground. What are they going to do? Needham literally next week. And will that become a wave of pretty quick adoption? And so the numbers of communities moving towards full compliance with the guidelines, as of before this court decision, if the number of those communities adopting jumps significantly in the next few weeks or a couple months, that suggests a sort of glide path towards normalcy. MBTA communities becomes the law of the land that everybody's working towards. Or will there be some other wave of resistance and follow-on court cases? And I think those would suggest pretty different paths forward for the next year or two on this.
What about you, Greg?
I'm really grateful that the governor, lieutenant governor, and every corner of her administration has been so all in housing. I mean, you talk to the Economic Development Secretary Howard, listen to her, and she'll talk about housing. You talk to Lauren Jones, Secretary of Labor, she'll talk about housing. Listen to Monica Tibbetts, she'll talk about housing. So they're all in, and that's really important that we have that kind of top-down leadership, and I'm really grateful for it.
I think the one niggling thing for me was how to interpret essentially the 30-some communities that said, we'll essentially push our luck. We're going to wait and see how the court comes down on that and, essentially make me rezone, make me do this. And we've talked a decent amount about the relationship between local power and the state itself, but I guess this is a little bit of a tea leaf question. How deep do you think the objection goes? Is it just kind of a wait and see, and if we don't have to move, the response is usually an inertia issue? They don't tend to like to rezone unless they have to rezone. You've talked about the deadlines as a movement. Or is there something that indicates a real entrenchment that you're watching and worrying about going forward? Where do you see it in those two poles, Greg? In your communities?
So, our communities are all going to pass it, and even if Needham goes back to the drawing board, they will probably, more likely than not, pass a compliant plan. Not a plan that's going to yield much housing, but pass a compliant plan. I do think what's interesting with the holdouts is, will the Attorney General say, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it for you, and here's your zoning plan, and you adopt it because you're required, and a whole level of battle that comes from that. That'll be interesting to see what happens.
Luc?
And because the SJC's decision makes clear that the Attorney General does have that authority, I do expect the vast majority of these communities will adopt some plan. And it comes back to the sort of paper compliance or something more in the full spirit of the law question. But I do think that means medium term, most will be a plan at minimum.
And that very much is consistent with what Attorney General Andrea Campbell said during a press conference on the day of the decision, which is, my hope is that there isn't going to be additional legal action. I essentially just expect that the ruling should convince all of these cities and towns to end up complying. So we will see about that. Luc, Greg, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Greg Reibman and Luc Schuster for joining me on the Codcast this week. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith, our producer is Claire Wigglesworth, and you can leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us. If you ever want to get in touch directly, we're on email, of course, at codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org. And we'll be back next week.